kind of how I pick all my alcohol, is just if it has cool art on it or not. Usually works out okay for me.
It's a valid way to pick it, yeah.
I always judge a book by its cover. Alcohol, books, anything. If it looks pretty, I'm probably going to pick it up.
A lot of wines like that, too. They have, like, cool labels.
To be fair, I don't think I've ever had a bad wine, and I usually only pick the ones that look cool, so it works out.
Welcome back to another episode of Is Fitz Happy? I'm Luke.
And I'm Emma.
And this week we're discussing chapter 1, the prologue of Ship of Magic.
Dun, dun, dun.
A new book, a new series.
Yeah.
So welcome on in, everybody. We are Is Fitz Happy, which doesn't quite make sense for this trilogy, but we are a podcast that is discussing Rob and Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings in publication order. So if you've joined in on this episode, we have already been through
the Farseer trilogy.
Yeah, the Farseer trilogy: Assassin's Apprentice, Royal Assassin, and Assassin's Quest. And we've gone through chapter by chapter, reading them, discussing them, talking about spoilers for future books. We've talked about theories, talked about different characters and their motivations, and that is what we're going to do with this trilogy as well. So right. Thanks for listening. We get to dive. It's exciting for us because we spent the past 2.25 years in a different trilogy. So
with Fitz, and
Fitz, yeah,
that's long enough to spend in Fitz's head. I'm glad to get a little bit of a break.
And is Fitz happy? No. We get to dive into the world of serpents.
Yeah, the worst. Yeah. I sound much more excited, mostly because we're starting a new series. So I'm like very excited to start. But also, we're diving right into the ocean dwellers of the deep.
Yes. And it's only 2 pages for you to suffer through.
I know. Honestly, these 2 pages took me out of the book. And the first time reading it took me a couple months to get past these first 2 pages.
You were definitely not a fan.
Nope.
Still are not a fan of the serpents.
To be fair, for this project, reading through was not so bad.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm ready. I poured myself a little scotch. We got a candle lit in the room, We're
really setting the mood for this.
Got a mood set for 2 pages to go. So let's dive in. This prologue is called The Tangle.
Yes.
And we get introduced to the serpents in the Liveship Traders here. And Maulkin is the first word in the first serpent that we are introduced to. Remember, he is the kind of seer serpent, the one who remembers the past in visions and hazy rememberings. At least he knows when to move to go to like the migration and the breeding grounds and things like that.
Right. It's known that he is this way because he has the eye design throughout his body.
The false eyes.
Yes, false eyes, and that makes him marked as someone having ancient sight, which it is denoted. Something that I don't think I think of a lot when I think of the serpents is that although we're following Maulkin and his Tangle, he is not the only one with ancient sight, and there are other Tangles that have ancient sight leaders.
One of them is mentioned in this prologue as well.
Yes.
We'll get there. So the beginning part of this prologue has descriptions of what Maulkin is doing and what he is. Right now they are shedding their old skin. They're in warm waters, and they have been for a while. There are 24 other serpents in that tangle, and it's a pretty, in my mind at least, a pretty literal description of what it is. They're all just kind of like sitting in a knot.
Yes.
And he's saying that at least Robin Hobb is saying he moved his long, sinuous body through a lazy loop, rubbing against himself to rub off the last scraps of outgrown hide. As the bottom muck started to once more settle, he gazed about at the 24 other serpents who lay basking in the pleasantly scratchy sediments. And he announces, "Time," he bugled in his deep-throated voice. "The time has come."
So The rest of his group understands this meaning to be the time has come to move, to go migrate to the hatching grounds.
Yes.
That isn't really talked about in depth in this prologue, but we know that as rereaders, and that it seems that the serpents know that that's what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. And as some history or as some recap from what I recall, now I have not read these books in a little bit, but from what I recall, these serpents have been swimming around for a couple hundred years already.
Right.
A couple hundred cycles they have missed because there was a huge cataclysm that changed the breeding grounds and where they were located. They sunk some, they raised up some others, and they need a specific sort of sand and silt to weave the cocoons
Right.
for them. So that cataclysm that wiped out the Elderlings kind of disrupted the whole dragon life cycle as well.
Right. And the capability of them to make the life cycle.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting that we're starting off with this sense of having a creature that knows the future, mostly because
it's a familiar ground.
Yes, it is. It's very reminiscent of the Fool, only a little bit more in depth to what this creature is thinking. It also begs the question of how long have they been here, and like in this specific moment, and how does he know? Is it just because it's been the right amount of sun and moon cycles? So instinctively it's like, okay, well,
from what I'm gathering, it's just kind of an instinctive feel for those certain chosen serpents who have the false eyes. It's not even like them counting seasons or anything, because some Tangles have moved on already and most of them are still in the area. It's just kind of a feeling and an instinct per leader of the Tangles.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point, because I think this trilogy as a whole is one that focuses a lot on intuition and kind of luck. I think that's a big theme that flows throughout this series. I mean, I guess the series as a whole, as Realm of the Elderlings, but specifically this trilogy.
Yeah. Because we focus on, Kenneth and his luck and a lot of things like that. And Amber and her luck in choosing who she chose, and maybe the unluckiness of not going along with Althea, but the luck that it worked out anyways in Amber's favor,
Right.
There's all these different things. The twists of fate seem to work out. And we had discussions about fate in the last book, but
yeah, but this one, it feels a little bit easier to follow, mostly because it's not just the fate of one person or one person's outcome. Like, we only see what Fitz does and how that affects the world. Whereas in this series, we get to follow like 7 characters and they're all interwoven. And so we like really get to see the larger world play out of all the choices all these characters make.
Yeah. And I guess we didn't really touch on it too much, but before we move on, how did you really feel going from a first person perspective to immediately the prologue of the first book of the next trilogy? First of all, not involving Fitz, which we have never had.
Right.
All of the prologues, epilogues, all the chapters in the other trilogy were about Fitz and from Fitz's point of view. And this is to a non-human character. And then the chapter 1 is, I think, split in between 2 or 3 points of view?
2 points.
2 points of view?
So
how did that jar you?
Okay, so I think personally, whenever I read books, I don't really gravitate towards books typically that have more than one narrator. I just don't find them as enjoyable usually.
Which is so weird to me, because reading a lot of fantasy, that's kind of the trend now.
Yeah.
Is to have multiple points of views.
I think whenever I'm reading fantasy, I like to put myself solely in the shoes of one person and live their life. And something that I don't love about multiple characters and like seeing from their point of view is that I don't ever feel like I'm really settling into the shoes of one character. And I guess that's nice because you get a broader view of the story as a whole. But prior to this, I hadn't seen it done well enough to enjoy the process. And it really just took me out of reading of an experience. So I wasn't like excited to read this series when I started it the very first time, because I had this idea of like, I'm not really going to get into it. I'm not going to care about any of these characters enough. And then I thought it was done really well. And I ended up actually liking the series a lot, this trilogy of the series.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
I don't know. What about you?
It was fairly normal to me.
Fair.
Because I've read other, fantasy series before. Honestly, I've probably read way more multiple points of view than I have first person point of view. I can only think of maybe 3 other series off the top of my head that are first person point of view.
Wow.
All the other ones are multiple, or they jump around. Right. So going into this, it was definitely interesting having serpents or some sort of undersea dweller. We didn't really
right.
know, I guess, at this point, as a point of view character. But I was intrigued by it. And then moving on to the next chapter, having them switch in between those two, it was pretty normal. So I wasn't really thrown by it. It was a little bit off-putting because I was in Fitz's shoes for so long.
Right.
And I think I immediately hopped into this book afterwards. So
yeah.
I think after this trilogy, I took a break and then went back to Fitz, and then I took a break, and then
Yeah.
But between the first trilogy and this trilogy, I think I went straight through, and I kind of learned my lesson of like, it's a little bit jarring just to switch gears that quickly.
Right.
But it was a fairly natural settling in, at least.
Yeah, that's fair. I think another thing that kind of put me off of this series at first was we go straight into like you said, a creature point of view. It's not even human. And because we had just gotten done with Fitz and staying with Fitz, I think I just assumed that the series would only be about Maulkin. And so I was really worried that now I have to be like with this weird group of serpents that aren't even human, and they have weird, not that I don't enjoy like out there ideas, I guess. It just, the thought of reading the whole book from Maulkin's point of view did not thrill me. I don't want...
What an interesting thought, though. Yeah. Like, how would that... I mean, it would just be a lot of swimming, right?
Right. Like tides. And it would be interesting to see if they had thoughts about like humans and their dwellings. And I feel like it could go in more depth of like, we know these boats or something, or like we're attracted to the live ship boats in some way. But yeah, I was like, I don't know how she's going to make this enjoyable, so I do not want to read this.
I can't remember if I warned you or told you about the multiple points of view. So were you kind of thrown off by this not being first person at all?
Yeah, so you didn't warn me. I think I complained to you about, I was like, I don't like the serpents. I don't want to read any more of the serpents. You're like, it's literally 2 pages. And I'm like, okay, we just got done with the book. And you're like, no, there's like multiple points of view. So I think it was really jarring to go.
Yeah, okay.
Like not first person right away.
Yeah, because it is interesting. So we start with that Maulkin, saying, it's time. It's the time has come to move on. And we immediately switch to, it's not in his head at all. We immediately switch to the perspective to Shreever, another serpent here.
Yes.
Who has great eyes of green and gold and copper. All the serpents are. And then they're kind of looking at Maulkin here. And then Shreever speaks up and she says, "Why? The water is warm here, the feeding easy. In 100 years, winter has never come. Why must we leave now?" I highlighted the in 100 years because this Tangle and the serpents in general are extremely old, way older than they should be. And they have already spent 100 years here.
Yeah.
In this particular place, let alone the other places that they have been.
Right. It did make me wonder how do they know what years are, first of all?
Right. Yeah, I know.
Second of all, like, is this accurate, or is this like, it feels like we've been here
figure of
100
speech,
years. And so that like also is really throwing me off.
I do know, I don't know the exact figures. I feel like we learn it at some point, maybe talking about or talking to Icefire in one of them.
Right.
But I know he spent a lot of time by himself searching for other dragons. And I feel like he measured that in like serpent cycles or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I feel like they've been here for at least a couple hundred years.
Right. No, definitely. And it is really interesting because we know that dragons don't really view time the way humans do, which is noticeable in the next Trader trilogy. So 2 from this series.
The Rainwild Chronicles?
Yes, the Rainwild Chronicles, where they have children, I guess even the final trilogy, where they have children who are suffering from birth defects because the dragons aren't there to keep up with the growth of a human growth cycle. And the dragons are very nonchalant about it and kind of don't care because it's not that much time to them, but it's decades in human time. And that's too long to be gone from humans. So it's really interesting to see them say something like it's been 100 years, because I wonder if that means like their version of 100 years or 100 human years.
Yeah.
But it seems like Shreever is not the only one who is reticent to believe that it is time.
Mm-hmm.
Shreever is kind of talking for the group at this moment.
And Maulkin performs another lazy twining of himself and flashes what we were talking about before, his false eyes, proclaiming him as one who kind of sees the future a little bit, in their words, with ancient sight. Maulkin could recall things from the time before all this time. His perceptions were not clear, nor always consistent. Like many of those caught twixt times, with knowledge of both lives, he was often unfocused and incoherent.
So I was thinking about the ancient sight and how Maulkin is a male serpent.
Yes.
But it seems as though for dragons, when they get out of the serpent cycle, the female is the lead. It's more of a matriarchal society.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really interesting that here in the serpents, when they're children, more or less, they have the opposite, where the men, I guess, I don't know if this is just like luck of the draw who gets the ancient memories, quote unquote.
I feel like it is in my mind. I mean, we don't have evidence for that.
To be fair, the goddess of the other island is a serpent that has the eyes that is marked as an ancient memory, and I believe that's a female because it is called a goddess. So I guess maybe it is
the
just
serpent
random.
that Wintro frees eventually.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess I was thinking it's a little strange, but I don't know. Maybe it is just random. But how does only one in a group get? Like
I feel like the groups are formed after. They surround themselves by one person who has it. There's a select few who have that sight, and then people choose to follow that person who has that sight. So it's not like one person out of every group is chosen. It's some people are chosen, then groups are formed after.
Fair. I guess that's a better way to look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is really interesting. And it seems as though Maulkin may be one of the more flighty of those that are chosen.
At least compared to someone else that is mentioned in here.
Yes.
We also get mention of Serpent's toxin. He shook his mane until his paralyzing poison made a pale cloud about his face. He gulped his own toxin in, breathed it out through his lungs, in a show of truth vow. What a interesting sentence.
Yes.
In the first page of a new trilogy. He shook his mane. We don't know who these people are yet, or these things are.
Right.
So he has a great maned head, as described before. So he shakes his mane and toxins come out.
Mm-hmm.
He gulps it in, and it's a show of truth vow. And we learn later that these are kind of like drugs almost.
Right.
Or at least stimulants of some sort to other serpents. And they use it to, fight each other or displays of strength or whatever it is. But the ones who have the ancient sight seem to also use it as like ayahuasca or like some hallucinogenic, like, I'll show you the way,
right.
kind of, I have the power. So I thought that was really interesting as like a first page description. There's a lot of tropes about fantasy series, like, your intro is filled with words that have apostrophes and things that you don't know what they're talking about. And I thought that was like words we all know, but it's hard to grasp what it's talking about unless you're rereading.
Right. Yeah, it is a lot of, it feels like jargon being used. Yeah. And it's hard to understand what means what right now. I think, to go back to why I didn't like it to begin with, I think that was part of it. It just felt so like non-comforting because it's so much at once of oddness. Whereas the Fitz series, yes, there are words and phrases and ideas put forth that aren't necessarily things that we have in real world, but they're kind of eased in more, I feel.
Definitely. I mean, you're introduced into a world in Assassin's Apprentice where it's a young boy who is dropped off, doesn't know what's going on, and it's literally just about his abandonment, his loneliness,
right,
and his dog companion eventually, and his guardian. And then you learn like, oh, there's a wit. Like, what is that? Oh, it's the bond that he's feeling.
Exactly. And here we have a lot of new, a lot of weird. Mm-hmm. And as we go on, it becomes this thing that you kind of understand. And it, I think, marks a clear, distinct difference between serpent and human. And I think it's done really well. I think it just can be intimidating to readers, especially going straight from the Fitz trilogies.
For sure.
But the truth has been told. Truth vow given.
It is time now, he urged. He speeds suddenly away from them, shooting up to the surface, rising straighter and faster than the bubbles, far above them. He broke the ceiling and leaped out briefly into the great lack before he dove again. He swam about them in frantic circles, wordless in his urgency. And Shreever responds to this kind of frenetic energy, saying, some of the other Tangles have already gone. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to notice they are missing when we rise into the lack to sing. Perhaps it is time. How do you pronounce this next serpent? Caesarea?
Sure. I go, and then read the next words.
Okay. Caesarea settled deeper into the muck. And perhaps it is not, he said lazily. I think we should wait until Auburn's Tangle goes. Auburn is steadier than Maulkin. And that's the other, we're assuming, ancient-sighted Tangle leader.
Right.
Who is apparently steadier than Maulkin and not as you described him, flighty.
Right. Which is really interesting. It's fun to see that these creatures do have very distinct personalities. I think it's interesting because we know they become dragons and we as rereaders know kind of how dragons act. So to think of full-grown dragons and see how serpents act, you can kind of see similarities between the two.
Specifically, these serpents become the dragons that we know in the Rain and Wild Chronicles.
Yes.
I believe Maulkin becomes Mercor. I think Shreever is Sheeby, who is...
Not Sheeby.
I think so.
Oh, no.
Who is Rapskulls.
Yeah, the kind of runt.
I think Rapskulls is bronze. I don't know. Shreever is red. And I'm not sure who's like what Shreever grows into or if Shreever shows up. But I know Maulkin is Mercor.
Okay.
That's the only one I know for sure. I thought in my head it made sense, but maybe it's just because of the SH. I don't know. But anyways, Shreever to Caesarea saying like maybe Auburn's is better. Shreever's like, well, you can just go join his Tangle then, because I don't doubt Maulkin's words and I'll follow him north. And she kind of, rubs off the rest of her molting skin as well, reveals a bright red instead of the dark, dull maroon, and joins him in the circling around of the Tangle.
It is also mentioned that she gulps down the flaking skin.
Yes.
Which is the first time we see the skin being eaten. Maybe Maulkin ate his skin, but it isn't described as happening. And so this is the first hint we get of how dragons work, how there is this idea that the flesh is sacred and it holds memory. And so it's important to hold on to that by consuming it.
Yes.
A lot like the stone dragon before in the last series.
And a lot like when the serpents are cocooned up and they, break free from their cocoons grown to dragons, they eat the rest of their cocoons.
Right.
To save those memories from the dragons that made those cocoons, the saliva.
Yes.
So Shreever joins that frenetic dance and says, I come, Maulkin, I follow you. She moved up to join their still circling leader in his twining dance overhead. One at a time, the other great serpents heaved their long bodies, free of clinging muck and outgrown skin. All, even Caesarea, rose from the depths to circle in the warm water just below the ceiling of the plenty, joining in the Tangle's dance. They would go north, back to the waters from whence they had come, in the long ago time that so few now remembered. So a quick vocab update. The lack is the air.
Yes.
The plenty is the water.
Yes. I wonder if this means that serpents cannot breathe air.
I don't think they can. Which is really, I guess like tadpole to frog,
Right, yeah. Very interesting. I also wanted to point out that it says that they're going to go north. We know that by the end of this trilogy, they are in Bingtown or near Bingtown.
Pirate Isles.
Yes,
yeah.
To start their cocooning process. So if that is north from where they are, do you think that means that right now where they're at is near where the white ones currently are?
Yes, I think so. I think they are. That's even further south than south of Jamalia.
Yeah.
So I don't think they're as far down as that, because I feel like they would be dead.
Why do you say that?
Because the whites are trying to destroy all of the dragons.
Right, but there's no way for them to become dragons at this point, so potentially the whites would leave them alone.
That's fair. That's a fair assumption. But still,
Fair.
In my head, it just makes sense that they're not as far as that island.
Okay.
Because it's always described in the last trilogy that Claris is south beyond any maps that they can find. So I feel like, yes, they are south. They're south of Jamalia, even in the warm water where like it doesn't ever become winter.
Yeah.
So
maybe
equatorial,
Yeah. Maybe near where the Fool is from. Beloved.
Yeah. Possibly.
Beloved's hometown.
Yeah. So they're heading up, up north towards Jamalia at the moment, and then eventually further north to the Pirate Isles.
Yes.
And the slavers.
Yeah. Although I will say they have mentioned already that some serpents have left where they are. It's really unclear how many serpents there are total ever at any given time.
Right.
We don't know. At least more than 24, because there is more than one group, and at least 2 groups isn't enough to make a big difference. It seems like we can assume that groups are normally around the size of 24.
Right.
So
yeah.
That's a ton of baby dragons that
are just lost.
Yeah, and not very many of them make it. It really makes me wonder, how many even get to the grounds where they are? Are there still serpents circling around that didn't make it this time?
I think so.
I don't know. It's just crazy to think about. And then I also was thinking they've come to this warm place. They've been here for at least 100 years by their counting of years, whatever that means. And it made me think about the fact that maybe they're drawn to the heat because part of them knows that that is how they need to grow as a dragon.
Yeah.
Because
it was just comforting, you know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess also who wants to be in the cold?
Reptilian-ish.
Right. So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting that we see a little bit of likeness to dragon peeking through here and there.
Yeah, for sure.
I think the other thing that we haven't talked about quite yet is the sing, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Which is mentioned. Mm-hmm. And this seems to be some sort of ritual where all of the serpents
just kind of like trumpet to one another.
Trumpet up into the lack. And I feel like we get some excerpt later where they do a sing, and it feels as though they're kind of almost trance-like when they do it, right?
Yeah, I seem to remember that as well.
Yeah, it feels like it's just part of their nature where they need to sing every once in a while out of the air.
It's kind of like a traditional communication kind of thing.
Right. And I wonder if part of that used to be to like call to their mothers, kind of like baby chicks, you know, call out to their mom when they're hungry. Not that I think that a dragon would necessarily feed a serpent.
Right. But like it would, yeah, because they would be, you know, capable of finding their own food.
Right.
Presumably. But to announce where they are, to like be guided. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. So very interesting things. I also think it's really interesting to have another character where they can kind of see the past/future. And that is a role that previously the Fool had been playing for us. I guess Fool was more future/maybe past. But yeah, it's really cool to see this new dynamic.
100%, yeah. Well, that wraps up the epilogue. Emma, do you have any other notes that you've written down about it?
I don't think so. I think most of my questions for this were just, how do they know? Yeah, why or how? That's what I asked in these 2 pages a lot.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have anything to say about the serpents, if you know more about their history or how long they have been there, or any theories about them at all, or just thoughts in general about Liveship Traders, please let us know. It is fitzhappy@gmail.com. I see a look on your face right now, Emma. What do you have to say?
I was just wondering, do you think there is a tie between the white ones and dragons in similar ancestors?
We don't know anything about the whites at all.
Right.
Besides that they knew that they were dying. They were a prescient race, and they bred with regular humans to hopefully have their genes come across one another in the future. So what we have at Claris is kind of a bastardization of what they once were. So I really don't know.
I was just thinking about how
kind of similar-ish in some...
Right. They're both not human. They're distinctly other. And they both seem to have some greater knowledge of how the world works and the turning of the world. Although one is more past-heavy and the other is future-heavy.
Yeah.
So,
opposites
I don't know.
In some sort of way.
Yeah, so I just thought it was really interesting. I think there's a lot of characteristics that I personally am going to be looking out for to see if we can maybe see, like maybe the original white was an other.
Possibly, but I feel like, the others are on Other Island are dragons that have become too human, right?
I thought they were serpents that were born of dragons who became too human.
Okay. Yeah. They're still like walking around. They have like legs and stuff. But yeah, it's some sort of like they became too human. So that wouldn't be around whites at all. I don't know. It's hard to say because we don't get anything of the history. This is another thing like similar to skill and wit.
Yes.
And I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah. I don't know, just a thought I had, just something I'm going to be looking out for going forward.
If you guys have any thoughts about that, please email us, isfitshappy@gmail.com. Or you can reach out at any of our social medias. It is Fitzhappy. We're at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can DM us or comment directly to us on our posts, anything like that, and we'll try to reach out and respond. We appreciate all of you messaging in, and we look forward to discussing this trilogy with you guys.
Yeah.
A new one.
Exciting. Okay, so surprise, we have some listener comments to talk about. This time is going to be a little bit weird because we're transitioning from the old into the new. So obviously we don't have any listener comments about the Liveship Traders series yet.
And probably for the next couple weeks, we do try to record these in advance. It doesn't always work out,
yeah,
but
not to take away the magic, but these are in advance. So some of the comments we're talking about today are going to be more focused on
the last couple episodes,
yes.
like 107.
Yes, the last trilogy as a whole, really.
Yes.
So yeah, we just wanted to clean some of that stuff up as we transition into this new book. And then as we get the questions in for this series, we will bring those in. But while we still have some that are about Fitz, we'll probably do that for the next couple episodes. So without further ado, first we're going to talk a little bit about the reaction that a lot of our listeners had to a question that I asked for episode 107 about how you guys would handle the revenge, what revenge you would have taken on Regal
yeah.
if you were in Fitz's shoes. And I'm not really going to name names because there were a lot of really good answers, and I think it would take way too long to go through all of them individually. But it was really interesting to see kind of the wide array of, I think that revenge is horrible and I would have done way worse. So it's really interesting to see just the large change and of opinion between people, of some people who don't think Fitz went far enough and some people who kind of think Fitz may have went too far by getting revenge at all. And I just thought that was really interesting. I was not expecting such a stark difference.
And there was a couple people who thought like this was a perfect revenge, just make him switch his allegiances basically.
Right.
But then there was also like, why didn't he get a royal pardon?
Yes.
You know, why didn't he say like, hey, Regal, make sure to mention to Kettrikin that
Fitz is
all right.
innocent and you take it back. I know, I agree. That response was very funny. It made me laugh of, you know what? I didn't even think about that. He did talk about how he stopped himself from making Regal erect a statue in his honor, but he could have still given himself a pardon.
Yeah, I just thinking a little bit more about that. He kind of stopped himself because what he had Regal do, while unbelievable to us, was believable to the people that he was ruling, because he had a dream, like the real people are returning.
Yes.
You know, he fought alongside his common folk. They believed him. And all of a sudden he tells his common folk, like, the person I've been demonizing for the past 2 years did not do what I said.
Right.
Would they follow him at all? So maybe Fitz thought it through. I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like Regal's Weasley enough to have wormed his way out of
definitely
it. Definitely
true. I'm just trying to make excuses.
I wish he would have given himself a pardon too. But it was really fun to get to see all the different responses and some of the harsher punishments.
Definitely like way more like physical punishments for Regal, to the revenge is wrong, but it was okay that this had this happened to him, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. It was very fun. So thank you guys for responding so readily to that. It was very fun.
We also had this is going a little bit further back in the series, but we had a really interesting email from Jonas talking about the two brothers, Chivalry and Verity, how they really complemented one another, because Chivalry was a very subtle, adept, skilled, I guess, manipulator, but like social
politician.
And his skilling was like a bull and very blunt and just a blunt force, while Verity, on their other hand, is a very blunt soldier
Yes.
who, just wanted to fight things and not really rule or anything like that. Just wanted to be the second man.
Yeah, it doesn't really have a delicate touch.
Yeah, and he had the very subtle and delicate skilling.
Yes.
So they complemented each other in magic and in real life, and they were a perfect pair working together, and that's probably also why Verity really felt out of place when Chivalry abdicated and then died. So
yeah.
it was it's going back a ways in the trilogy, but I thought it was a very interesting point because it does fill out Verity's character a little bit more, which we talked about a lot in the last few chapters. So
yeah, it definitely was an interesting thought process to think about. So thank you, Jonas. And finally, to wrap up this round of questions and thoughts, we got a really interesting comment on Instagram from Hammergarumi. Sorry if that is a horrible pronunciation. We just kind of roll with things here. They posted a really interesting thought process about Fitz's pain with having switched places with Verity. And I thought it was a really interesting conversation that I wanted to bring forward, and so did Luke, where they said, kind of in defense of Verity, that...
Because, just as a context...
Yes.
I mean, particularly Emma, I'll say that. I'll point it out. Was very upset at Verity and felt like his character was a little bit tarnished in that chapter, just because he went ahead seemingly knowing that Fitz didn't know what was going on.
Right. It didn't feel like consent.
Right. So Hammergarumi comments here.
Yes. And they said that this is kind of a tale of why informed consent is important, because
there was consent from Fitz to swap, bodies for Verity to go ahead, right? And Verity took that as consent, but it was not informed on Fitz's part because Fitz had no idea what was going to happen.
Right.
He was just okay with it until it actually happened.
Right. And so Verity didn't really explain anything, and he didn't try to go into the details that Fitz might have been uncomfortable with. He just vaguely asked consent
and kind of assumed.
Yeah. And since Fitz affirmed and said yes, it was to him consent, which is still morally gray. They don't say that this is fine or that it was a good thing, but it does lead to a more interesting portrayal. It is much more human, and the morally gray aspect is very real. And I think it is a really good example of why informed consent is important.
Yes.
That it's not enough to just say yes. You have to know what you're saying yes to. And the person asking should know that.
And the same person actually brought up a different point as a final thing.
Yes.
Talking, and this is a little bit of change of subject. Sorry for the abrupt change, but after that, when Will is getting attacked by the stone dragon, and we were discussing him losing a leg instead of dissolving and losing his life force, we kind of mentioned that, he's skilled. Maybe that's why blah, 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 blah. He didn't get absorbed. Hammergarumi goes into a little bit more, saying maybe because he was so strongly skilled, maybe he could fight back against that loss of life, that loss of memory. If you're trained in the skill, I'm extrapolating a little bit more from that comment, so this isn't exactly what they said, but if you're trained in the skill, you are able to walk along the skill road and not lose your memories, your mind along there. And I feel like it's somewhat similar in that you have more of a knowledge of who you are. You're able to gather yourself and say, this is me. I'm not going to dissolve and disappear into this dragon. Right.
Well, I mean, we see that Verity has kept Fitz separate from himself enough so that Fitz isn't accidentally put into the dragon.
Yeah. So there must be some defensive measures that a skilled one can take.
Right.
Which is what Hammergarumi was kind of pointing out.
Yeah, which is a really, really good point and really interesting, a little bit more in depth than our little brush aside of, oh, well, he's skilled.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, definitely good thoughts. So thank you to everyone who sent in questions or thoughts or answered our question for the chapter, or any chapter. It's always really good to hear what you guys have to say. So see you next week.